Reading 51 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll. Great Amwell House, November 2nd, 1946. A Note on Buried Conscience. This work is about reaching a higher level called the third state of consciousness. This level exists in us as a possibility. The second level of consciousness, the level of so-called waking consciousness, in which we spend our lives, is a level below the third level. All forms of thought, all emotional reactions, all feelings of oneself, the way one takes things ordinarily, belong to the second level. We seek to reach the third level. About what can we be quite sure? We can be quite sure that at the third level, the way of thinking and feeling, the sense of what is important and unimportant will be utterly different. Another order will be reached. The third level is experienced by many during their lifetime as a flash, a momentary experience. They are for the moment without any time feeling, and so without any sense of identifying. Troubles, cares, anxieties, all their sources of being identified, lie far below them. But these moments are not enough. They merely indicate something possible to reach. Work is about separating from everything that does not belong to this third level, which is our real aim. People say, "Why should I work?" Or they say, "What does this work mean?" This work is based on real knowledge, which concerns how the attainment of this third level is possible. For example, why should you not identify fully with everything? The answer is that if you do, you will get nothing from the work. You serve yourself as you are. You serve life. You serve nature. Therefore, you are used by the cosmic forces that seek to keep you asleep. Now, a person may say, "I will not serve this cosmic purpose. I will not give way to useless suffering. I will not identify myself with negative emotions. I will become conscious." But he can do nothing by himself. In the first place, new knowledge must be given to him. And in the second place, when trials come, as they always must, at certain periods, he must use them practically. That is, he must really be able to think in a new way about his trials. New knowledge cannot be put into old bottles, that is, into the old mind. Understand that a higher level of consciousness means another way of thinking, not the old way, stepped up. The freeing of the mind from its old habitual ways of thinking, the freeing of oneself from one's old mind and its way of thinking, the freeing of oneself from one's habitual emotions, takes place by stages, often at long intervals. It is comparable to climbing a stair, each step exhausting one's energy for the time being. Each person is given his own octave or staircase of development, and what may be easy for one person is not necessarily so for another. But the sum total, the quantity of effort necessary for reaching internal freedom, is the same for everyone. No one is better off than another person. To be given advantages, for example, will not help in the long run. Just where you have been helped will become eventually the most difficult place where you have to help yourself. And here you must remember two things, namely, the esoteric saying that the more you are given, the more is required of you, and that if you are told things beforehand that you should have found out for yourself by observation, you may think it is a help, as for instance, being told your chief feature before you have even caught a glimpse of it. But it is not a help. Actually, it will make things far more difficult. It interrupts a gradual inner process of unfolding, of seeing things for yourself, and seeing for yourself how something in you is wrong and hinders you. You may be sure that once your evaluation of the work is strong enough and you hear it enough and reflect upon it enough, you will see gradually unfolding the mystery of your own development. This mystery is different in each person. That is why it is so important not to compare yourself with other people. A great deal of negative emotion arises from comparison. Remember always that the work is equally difficult for everyone and that it does not become easier. It is always difficult, and yet it is not too difficult if one will remember enough and maintain a certain inner strength of will in regard to it. The greatest force that we can create in the work is understanding. A man must build his inner work on himself, up on the affirmation of the moments of understanding that he has had, and not let himself be shaken too much by outer events, whether in the work or in life, that seem to contradict what he understands himself. In no other way can the individual development take place. A person's understanding is his own growth of understanding and cannot be borrowed. I cannot borrow someone else's understanding, but I may borrow his knowledge, and through applying it to my being, come to a new understanding. And yet, his understanding and my understanding are two different things. They are both unique, individual. For example, I cannot borrow my teacher's understanding, but he gives me knowledge through which, when I apply it to my being, my own understanding grows. Remember that a growth of understanding can only come when new knowledge is applied to your own being. Knowledge and being together constitute our level of understanding. It would be no good my trying to imitate what my teacher does. That would be external imitation and would become part of the false personality. For example, if my teacher does not express negative emotion, and I imitate him, I understand nothing about negative emotion. My imitation is external. But if receiving knowledge from my teacher that I must work on the negative part of my emotional center, and that in order to do this I must observe my negative emotions uncritically and fight not to identify with them and see the reason why for myself, then I may also begin not to express negative emotion, just as my teacher does not. But this would no longer be from imitation. It would be from myself, from the growth of my own understanding, from the same experience as my teacher underwent. In this work, we are taught to work on the intellectual center and on the emotional center by taking in a new supply of ideas and arranging them in our minds so that we begin to think in a new way about everything. This alters connections in our minds. If the ideas of the work do not influence our thinking at all, if we never really think from the ideas of the work about ourselves, about other people, or about life, we will then be always following our habitual minds, our habits of thought. The first place that has to be altered in order to undergo a change of being is the mind itself. That is, the way we think. When we observe the intellectual center, we observe our thoughts and notice how we say I to our thoughts. But these habitual thoughts must be seen as habitual thoughts, as machinery. For example, need you think in this way that you are doing at present? This is the first challenge that you have to make to yourself if you want to change. Need you think in the way you are thinking at this moment? Challenge the thought. The thought is automatic. Did you go with it? Did you identify with it? Bring the work up into your mind and try to see whether the work teaches you to think in this way. Try to bring the system of thoughts, of ideas that the work teaches as knowledge to us into your previous form of thinking about yourself, or your habitual way of thinking about other people, or your habitual way of thinking about life. If you cannot do this, it means that you are identified with your mechanical thinking, which you have got haphazard from your upbringing. Are you sure that all these thoughts that you have gained from your upbringing are of any use at all? Now, to think from the ideas of the work requires an effort of internal attention. This work is to make us think in a new way. That is why you have to be reminded so often and for such a long time about what the work teaches, in order that eventually something takes place in you. Something quite definite and difficult to define when you no longer think habitually, but begin to think from what the work has been saying to you for years. When this happens, the work is born in your mind and you undergo a change of mind. A new set of ideas, a new set of associations is formed in the mental part of you. Then a long struggle takes place between your ordinary thinking and work thinking. It is as if the brain itself had to be altered in all its connections and reframed and reconnected on the basis of the knowledge of the work. We think from such knowledge as we have, but this work is new knowledge, and we have to begin to think eventually from this new knowledge about ourselves. And that is a great subject. And finally about life and what it means. And that again is a great subject. Once the new thinking coming from knowledge of the work begins to connect itself with our minds, we have moments in which we see things and understand things in a completely different way from what we usually do. Then we fall asleep and think in the ordinary way. That is, we are subject to oscillations, often very violent. Now, if we were always in the third state of consciousness, we should always think from the knowledge of the work. This would govern us, and everything would be quite easy then. We might simply withdraw into this new kind of thinking and meditate on it, as happens in some forms of yoga. But the trouble is that we also have an emotional center which for a long time does not obey our thoughts, and so it is necessary to work at the same time on the emotional center, in connection with the new knowledge of the work. And the first thing that is emphasized is that we must work on our negative emotions. Why should we work on our negative emotions? This is a very good question to ask oneself in all inner sincerity. And here the mind will help if the strength of the work ideas is beginning to form a new mind which has a small will of its own. The emotional center is the seat of our ordinary will, as it is, and the negative part of the emotional center is especially so. The small will from the change in mental center is not sufficient to control the will of the unredeemed emotional center for a long time. The will of the negative part of the emotional center coupled with the will of the physical body forms a very powerful antagonist to the will that is formed through the work in the emotional part of the intellectual center. But although we witness constantly our complete failure in controlling our negative emotions, or let us add the will of the body, yet if the relationship to the work and the valuation of its ideas are strong enough, there remains always, in spite of constant defeats, something in the background which does not consent to all that is going on. I do not think I have mentioned here, in connection with what the work says, that the knowledge of the work must become emotional, that the first place in which it can become emotional is in the emotional part of the intellectual center. As I said, it is here that the new will of the work is formed first of all. The problem then is the negative part of the emotional center itself, in which exist eyes that are very powerful and do everything they can to fight every form of belief that we possess in regard to this work. Now, if we had not got buried conscience, the situation would be hopeless. The negative eyes in the emotional center would always have the victory. The secret is, however, that in the emotional center there is buried conscience, and this is awakened by the emotional part of the intellectual center, when the ideas of the work have entered the mind and become emotionally felt, not only as what is truth, but as what is good. This awakens the buried conscience in the emotional center itself. The work teaches that buried conscience exists in everyone, quite apart from acquired conscience, which is a matter of local upbringing. But for this buried conscience, and the awakening of it in the emotional center through the new mind and its new will, we should indeed be in a hopeless position. But fortunately, as it is, every emotional perception of the truth of the work coming from the intellectual center arouses this buried conscience in the emotional center, and then the emotional center itself fights against its negative emotions. Now, if you do not keep the work strong in your mind and renew it continually, at least once a day, or at least often, if you do not rearrange everything in your mind at intervals so that you are thinking from the channels of the work and their connections, this awakening of the buried conscience begins to cease, and then you find yourself alone. When you feel alone like this, you must think of the work, as, for example, go over what was said at the last meeting and refresh your mind with it. This is a form of self-remembering in a practical way, and it will send a current of force to buried conscience in the emotional center, which alone can cast out your devils. It is not as if you do it, nor must you think that you can do it, but if you do what you can do, then something will help you which is not you, and which you must never ascribe to yourself. We get into a bad state often because we ascribe everything to ourselves, just as we ascribe our merit to ourselves, just as we ascribe our good to ourselves, which means, of course, that we inevitably ascribe our evil to ourselves. One must ascribe neither good nor evil to oneself, otherwise one stands in the way of one's development. The work is an instrument, first of all, a mental instrument, which must be used to put our thoughts in the right order, to get things straight. And if we do this with the memory of our past experience in the work, this effort to rearrange internally will stimulate this buried conscience in the emotional center, which can fight all negative emotions and cast out every devil in us. You cannot overcome a negative emotion directly. It will only get stronger as a rule. But you can, through your mind, through arranging the work in your mind, touch the emotional part of the intellectual center, which in turn awakens the buried conscience, which will attack by itself the negative emotions. The power of buried conscience derives from the higher emotional center. You must remember that the work teaches that man was once in touch with higher centers, but went to sleep. He once knew what to do directly, but now, in this state of sleep, he can only get to where he was by indirect methods. All that is left now is change of mind. Change of mind starts the whole possible recovery. That is why Christ taught always mitvoye, change of mind, as the first thing, not repentance, but change of mind. Unless the mind changes, whereby the attitudes change, everyone will always be just as he is. Whatever effort he makes in the way of starvation, self-denial, and so on, with the same attitude, a man will always remain the same. As long as a man thinks in the same habitual way, he will remain the same. The work can actually teach a man to think in a new way. I repeat, about himself, about others, and about the meaning of life. With this change of mind, his attitudes will inevitably change. If your attitudes have not changed, then you will not change, and you can never change. If, for example, your attitude is that you are a fully conscious man, and that you are a unity, and you have a permanent real I, and an inflexible will, and that you can do, and so on, then these attitudes and this way of thinking will fix you always in the same psychological place as you are in, and no new development is possible. But if your attitudes change through new thinking, through the ideas of the work, from esoteric teaching, then you can change, because you will begin to arouse buried conscience, which cannot work in you as long as you have all these false notions about yourself, about others, and about life, and ascribe all to yourself. It is exactly this new thinking, this mitvoya, that the work can give us. that, when emotionally felt, arouses into activity the buried conscience, which then begins to help you. So you will see how important it is to keep the work mentally living in oneself, not only by constant outer reminders of it, but by your own deeper inner thinking, because, as you know, this work is a rope let down that you have to jump to catch hold of. No doubt, sometimes one need no longer jump, but as we are, it is necessary to jump, that is, to make a certain kind of effort every day to jump up to the work. If you ask me, what is this effort? I will answer that I have said in the paper what this effort is. I will put it in reverse form. If you use the work merely as a means of occasional chats, then you are not making this effort.